I stood in the empty shell of Sweet Dreams Bakery at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, holding the foreclosure notice in my trembling hands. The crisp autumn air filtered through the broken front door, carrying with it the scent of maple leaves and the distant aroma of fresh coffee from the shop next door. This was the same bakery where I'd worked 16-hour days for 3 grueling years, where I'd spent countless nights perfecting recipes that would later win awards, where my own sister Sarah had fired me just 6 weeks ago for allegedly stealing recipes that were mine to begin with. The irony wasn't lost on me as I signed the purchase agreement with my new business partner, my estranged grandfather, William Chen, whose $3 billion empire Sarah never knew existed. His fountain pen felt heavy in my flour-stained fingers, the gold nib scratching across the legal documents that would make me the owner of everything Sarah had lost. "Congratulations, Miss Chen," said Mr. Peterson from First National Bank, extending his manicured hand toward mine. His expensive suit looked out of place in the debris-strewn bakery, and I could see him trying not to wrinkle his nose at the lingering smell of spoiled milk and forgotten dreams. "Sweet Dreams Bakery is officially yours. The keys, equipment manifest, and remaining inventory records are all here in this folder." I accepted the thick manila envelope, feeling its weight like a trophy in my arms. Looking around at the dusty display cases with their fingerprint-smudged glass, the commercial ovens with their doors hanging open like hungry mouths, and the cash register sitting abandoned on the scarred wooden counter, I could barely believe this was the same place that had sparkled with success just 2 months ago. Back then, Sweet Dreams had been the crown jewel of downtown Portland's culinary scene, with lines stretching around the block every morning and a waiting list for custom cakes that extended 3 months out. Now it was mine for exactly $127,000, a fraction of the $400,000 Sarah had paid when she'd leveraged our parents' modest inheritance to transform their small neighborhood bakery into what food critics had called a temple to artisanal excellence. She was nowhere to be found today, probably hiding in shame after the spectacular public meltdown that had destroyed everything she'd built on my stolen foundation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how my dear sister dug her own grave, one lie at a time. The story really begins 3 years ago, on a rainy Thursday in November, when the Oregon State Police knocked on our apartment door at 2:15 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I'd been up late working on a new recipe for rosemary olive oil bread, and the digital clock on our microwave had been blinking accusingly at me when the sharp raps echoed through our thin walls. Officer Martinez was young, probably not much older than Sarah, with kind eyes that couldn't quite hide the weight of the news he carried. "Are you Emma and Sarah Chen?" he asked, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat onto our welcome mat. "Yes," Sarah answered, pulling her robe tighter around herself. I stood behind her in my flour-dusted pajamas, my heart already sinking because nobody came to your door at this hour with good news. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but your parents, Michael and Lin Chen, were involved in a fatal automobile accident earlier this evening on Highway 26. A semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel and crossed the median. They were killed instantly." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my knees buckle. Sarah caught me as I stumbled, her arm strong around my waist, and for a moment, we were just two sisters clinging to each other in the face of unimaginable loss. Mom and Dad were gone just like that, on their way home from a suppliers conference in Eugene, where they'd been learning about new organic flour distributors for the bakery. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and tearful condolences, but I remember clearly the moment when our family lawyer, Mr. Hendricks, read their will. Sarah and I sat in his wood-paneled office, holding hands like we used to as children, listening as he explained that our parents had left us everything: the small bakery they'd run for 15 years, their modest savings account, and most importantly, a leather-bound recipe book that contained 3 generations of family baking secrets. "They wanted you both to continue the family tradition," Mr. Hendricks explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The will specifies that you're to be equal partners in Chen Family Bakery, with decisions made jointly." I was 22 then, fresh out of culinary school with a head full of dreams and a portfolio of innovative recipes I'd spent years perfecting in late-night sessions in our cramped apartment kitchen. Sarah was 25, armed with a business degree from Portland State, and an unshakable belief that her education made her naturally suited to leadership. She also had something I didn't, an absolute conviction that she deserved the lion's share of everything good that came our way. The transformation began almost immediately. "We need to rebrand," Sarah announced on our first day back at the bakery after the funeral. She stood in the middle of the small storefront, gesturing at the hand-painted sign our father had made 20 years ago. "Chen Family Bakery sounds so ethnic. We need something more universal, more appealing to a broader demographic." I looked around at the cozy space where I'd spent countless weekends as a child, learning to knead dough from my grandmother and decorating cookies with my mother. The walls were covered with family photos spanning decades. My great-grandmother standing proudly outside the original bakery in Chinatown, my grandparents on their wedding day with flour-dusted aprons, my parents cutting the ribbon at the grand opening of this location. Every inch of this place told our family's story. "I don't think we should change everything so quickly," I said carefully. "Maybe we could just add some new menu items, freshen up the display cases." "Emma?" Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I would come to dread. "I know you're emotionally attached to this place, but we need to think strategically. I've been researching the market, and artisanal bakeries are having a moment right now. We could triple our revenue if we position ourselves correctly." She was already pulling out her laptop, showing me spreadsheets and market analysis reports she'd compiled while I'd been mourning. In the weeks since our parents' death, while I'd been barely able to function, Sarah had been planning our empire. From day one, she made it clear who was in charge. "You're the baker, I'm the boss," became her constant refrain, relegating me to the kitchen while she handled all customer interactions, financial decisions, and public relations. I didn't mind at first. I loved baking, and I was naive enough to believe we were building something together, something that would honor our parents' memory while securing our financial future. I threw myself into the work with desperate intensity, channeling my grief into creativity. I developed new recipes that combined traditional techniques with modern flavor profiles: green tea shortbread with white chocolate and crystallized ginger, sourdough focaccia studded with Kalamata olives and sun-dried tomatoes, wedding cakes that looked like delicate works of art. I experimented with ancient grains, alternative flours, and seasonal ingredients from local farms. Sarah rebranded us as Sweet Dreams Bakery and launched an aggressive marketing campaign that positioned us as Portland's premier destination for artisanal baked goods. She hired a professional photographer to create stunning images of my creations, launched social media accounts that quickly gained thousands of followers, and began networking with food writers and restaurant critics throughout the Pacific Northwest. What I didn't realize, what I was too trusting and grief-stricken to see, was that Sarah had been systematically stealing credit for my work from the very beginning. Every recipe I created, every technique I developed, every innovation that brought customers flooding through our doors, she claimed as her own. When food bloggers called for interviews, she made sure to schedule them when I was busy with baking or deliveries. When industry publications wanted to feature our signature creations, Sarah posed for the photos and took all the credit. I started noticing small things that should have been red flags. Sarah would step in front of me when customers complimented my pastries, accepting their praise with gracious smiles. She began referring to my recipes as our family formulations in interviews, cleverly implying that she was the keeper of generations-old secrets. When the Oregonian's food critic visited for a review, Sarah made sure I was scheduled for a dental appointment, then spent 2 hours explaining the inspiration behind dishes she'd never made herself. The breaking point came 6 weeks ago, on a brilliant September morning when Food and Wine magazine called to say they wanted to feature Sweet Dreams in their annual Rising Stars issue. I was scrubbing burnt sugar from a sheet pan when Sarah burst into the kitchen, practically vibrating with excitement. "Emma, you're not going to believe this," she said, waving her phone in the air. "Jessica Martinez from Food and Wine wants to do a feature story on us. They're sending a photographer and everything. This could put us on the national map." I felt a surge of pure joy, the first uncomplicated happiness I'd experienced since our parents died. Finally, a chance to share my story, to talk about the passion and technique behind my creations, to honor the family traditions that had shaped my approach to baking. "When are they coming?" I asked, already mentally preparing talking points about my grandmother's lamination technique and the seasonal fruit partnerships I'd developed with local farms. Thursday at 2, Sarah said, then paused in a way that made my stomach clench. I've already confirmed the interview time. Great! I'll make sure to have a full selection of seasonal items ready, and maybe I can demonstrate the croissant process if they want. Actually, Emma, I think it would be better if I handled the interview alone. I stopped scrubbing and looked at her fully. What do you mean alone? Sarah's expression shifted into what I'd come to recognize as her managing difficult employees face. Patient but firm, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. You know how you get when you talk about baking. You go into all that technical detail about gluten development and fermentation times. Food and wine readers want to hear about inspiration and creativity, not chemistry lessons. But Sarah, these are my recipes, my techniques. Don't you think I should be part of our recipes? She corrected sharply. Remember, we're partners in this business. And as the public face of Sweet Dreams, I've built relationships with food writers throughout the industry. They know me, they trust me. It makes sense for me to handle media relations. I wanted to argue, but Sarah had already moved on, pulling out her phone to start typing notes for the interview. I went back to scrubbing my pan, telling myself that it didn't matter who got the credit as long as our business succeeded. We were sisters, partners, building something together. Her success was my success. I was such a fool. Thursday arrived with unseasonably warm weather and brilliant sunshine streaming through our bakery's front windows. I'd spent the entire previous day preparing what I considered to be my masterpiece showcase: perfectly laminated croissants with house-made raspberry jam, sourdough boule with crispy crusts and holes like Swiss cheese, delicate macarons and flavors inspired by my grandmother's herb garden, and my signature lavender honey cake, a recipe that had taken me 8 months to perfect. Jessica Martinez arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, a petite woman in her 40s with sharp intelligence in her dark eyes and a notebook that already contained pages of preliminary research. I was arranging the final display when she walked in, and I stepped forward to introduce myself. You must be Jessica. I'm Emma Chen, and I'm so excited to... Jessica! Sarah's voice cut across mine as she emerged from the office, dressed in the new designer blouse she'd bought specifically for this interview. So wonderful to finally meet you in person. I'm Sarah Martinez, owner and head baker of Sweet Dreams. I felt the words hit me like a slap. Martinez. She'd started using our mother's maiden name for business purposes months ago, claiming it was more accessible than Chen. But hearing her introduce herself as the head baker, when she'd never successfully made a loaf of bread without my help, sent a chill down my spine. Actually, I began, stepping forward again, I'm the head baker. Sarah handles the business side, but I developed all of our signature. Emma's just being modest, Sarah interrupted smoothly, placing a possessive hand on my shoulder. She's my assistant baker, and she's incredibly talented. But the recipes are family secrets I've been developing since culinary school. The casual cruelty of the lie took my breath away. Jessica Martinez looked between us with the keen awareness of someone who'd conducted hundreds of interviews, clearly sensing tension but not understanding its source. I see, she said carefully. Well, perhaps you could both walk me through some of these beautiful creations? What followed was the most humiliating hour of my professional life. I watched Sarah demonstrate her signature lavender honey cake technique, listening to her describe flavor profiles she'd never understood and explain methods she'd learned by watching me work. When Jessica asked about inspiration, Sarah spun elaborate stories about childhood memories of baking with our grandmother, memories that belonged to me, moments she'd never shared because she'd been too busy with her friends to spend time in the kitchen. The key to this particular cake, Sarah said, cutting into the golden layers I'd baked that morning, is understanding how lavender can overpower if you're not careful. I spent months perfecting the balance, learning to steep the cream at exactly the right temperature to extract the floral notes without the bitterness. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, remembering the dozens of failed attempts, the nights I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. adjusting ratios and temperatures, the tears of frustration when batch after batch came out wrong until I finally cracked the code. When Jessica asked about my role specifically, Sarah barely glanced in my direction. Emma helps with basic prep work and cleanup. She's learning the craft. Learning. As if I hadn't graduated magna cum laude from the Culinary Institute, as if I hadn't been developing original recipes since I was 15, as if everything beautiful and delicious in this bakery hadn't flowed from my hands and my imagination. I excused myself to the kitchen, claiming I needed to check on the ovens, and spent the remainder of the interview listening through the serving window as Sarah took credit for 3 years of my life's work. When Jessica finally left, promising that the feature would run in the December issue, Sarah was practically glowing with satisfaction. "That went perfectly," she said, already pulling out her phone to update our social media with photos from the shoot. Jessica was so impressed. "This is exactly the kind of national attention we need." We, as if she'd had anything to do with creating the recipes that had impressed the journalist. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my studio apartment, finally seeing the full scope of what Sarah had done. She hadn't just stolen credit for my recipes, she'd stolen my entire identity as a baker. In the eyes of the food world, I was nobody, just an assistant who helped the real talent. Every award we'd won, every glowing review we'd received, every moment of recognition that should have been mine, Sarah had claimed it all. But unlike my sister, I had something she didn't know about, something that would change everything. 3 months earlier, an elderly Chinese man had started visiting our bakery every Tuesday morning at exactly 9:15 a.m. He was always impeccably dressed in expensive but understated clothing, spoke with a slight accent that suggested English wasn't his first language, and had an uncanny ability to identify the most technically complex items on our menu. "The sourdough today is exceptional," he told me one morning in early June, his weathered hands carefully breaking apart a piece of my levain bread. "The crumb structure suggests a very patient fermentation process. 18 hours, perhaps 20? I looked up from arranging croissants in the display case, surprised. Most customers complimented the taste of my bread, but this man was commenting on technique. 22 hours, I said. "I find that extra time really develops the flavor complexity." He nodded approvingly. "Your grandmother taught you well. Traditional methods often produce superior results, despite what modern efficiency demands." Something about his phrasing made me pause. "I'm sorry, but how did you know my grandmother taught me?" He smiled then, an expression that seemed familiar in a way I couldn't place. "Lucky guess. Your technique has the patience of someone trained by older hands." Over the following weeks, our Tuesday morning conversations became a highlight of my routine. He introduced himself as William, never offering a last name, and demonstrated a knowledge of baking history and technique that rivaled my culinary instructors. He could identify the origin of flour by texture, guess fermentation times by examining crumb structure, and discuss the chemistry of gluten development with the casual expertise of someone who'd spent decades in professional kitchens. "You have remarkable intuition," he told me one morning in July, sampling a new almond financier recipe I'd been developing. "This balance of sweetness to tartness, the way the almond flavor emerges without overwhelming. It reminds me of a baker I knew many years ago." "Oh, someone local?" His expression grew distant. "Someone very dear to me. She had the same gift for understanding how flavors should dance together rather than compete." I was refilling his coffee when he asked, seemingly out of nowhere, "Tell me about your family, Emma. Are your parents involved in the business?" The question caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, I was telling him everything. About the accident, about inheriting the bakery, about feeling lost and overwhelmed by the responsibility of carrying on my family's legacy. He listened with the kind of focused attention that made me feel like my words actually mattered, nodding at appropriate moments and asking thoughtful follow-up questions. "All right, then, your parents would be proud of what you've built here," he said quietly when I finished. "Though I suspect you haven't been getting the recognition you deserve." That was the first time anyone had acknowledged what I was too afraid to admit even to myself, that I was being overshadowed in my own business. "Sarah handles the public relations side," I said carefully. "She's better with people than I am." William's expression sharpened. Better with people or better at taking credit? I nearly dropped the coffee pot. "I'm sorry. I've been watching Emma. I've seen how she steps in front of you when customers offer compliments. I've heard her accept praise for creations that clearly came from your hands." He leaned forward slightly. "I've also heard her refer to you as her assistant when speaking to other customers." Heat flooded my cheeks. I'd hoped my humiliation wasn't so obvious to outsiders. "It's complicated," I said weakly. "No," William said firmly. It's theft. She's stealing your work, your reputation, your future. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before I could respond, Sarah emerged from the office, her smile brightening when she spotted William. Over the past few weeks, she'd started making appearances during his visits, clearly recognizing him as one of our more affluent customers. Mr. William, how lovely to see you again. I hope you're enjoying our latest seasonal offerings. I've been experimenting with some new flavor combinations that I think you'll find quite innovative. I watched her performance with growing nausea. She was describing my new fig and rosemary scone recipe, complete with fabricated stories about her inspiration for the unusual pairing. William listened politely, his expression neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he wasn't fooled by her act. Indeed, he said when she finished. The technique required to balance those particular flavors suggests years of experience. Tell me, where did you train? Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Oh, well, I'm largely self-taught. Natural talent, you might say. How fascinating. And Emma, where did she develop her skills? Culinary Institute, Sarah said dismissively, though theoretical knowledge is quite different from practical application, as I'm sure you understand. I wanted to sink through the floor. Here was this obviously sophisticated customer who appreciated quality and technique, and Sarah was diminishing my professional training while claiming my work as her own. William nodded thoughtfully. Of course, well, I should be going. Emma, thank you for another excellent morning. He left his usual generous tip and walked toward the door, but paused at the threshold and turned back to me. Emma, I wonder if you might join me for coffee sometime? Outside of work. I have some thoughts about your situation that might interest you. He pressed a business card into my hand, and I felt the weight of heavy cardstock between my fingers. After he left, I retreated to the kitchen to examine the card in private. It was simple, elegant, and contained only 3 lines of text. William Chen Chairman and CEO Chen Industries. My hands started shaking as the implications hit me. Chen. The same last name I'd inherited from my father. Chen Industries, I'd heard of them, a massive manufacturing conglomerate with holdings throughout Asia and the Pacific Northwest. William Chen was one of the wealthiest men in Oregon, a billionaire whose business empire spanned shipping, real estate, and technology. But more than that, Chen, my family name, could it be? That evening, I called the number on the card with trembling fingers. Emma. His voice was warm when he answered, and I could hear relief in it. I wondered if you'd call. Are you my grandfather? There was a long pause, followed by what sounded like a shaky breath. Yes, my dear, I am. The story he told me over dinner that night changed everything I thought I knew about my family's history. 25 years ago, my father had been a struggling graduate student in engineering when he'd met my mother at a campus coffee shop. She was the daughter of William Chen, heir to a growing business empire, expected to marry within the Chinese-American business community and help expand the family's influence. Instead, she'd fallen in love with a kind, ambitious young man whose parents had immigrated from Mexico and built a small bakery in southeast Portland. I was a fool, grandfather said, his voice heavy with regret as we sat in a private dining room at Portland's most exclusive restaurant. I thought she was throwing her life away, marrying beneath her station. I gave her an ultimatum, him or the family. My mother had chosen love, accepting disownment rather than abandoning the man who made her happy. My grandfather had been too proud and stubborn to reconcile, even when she'd tried to reach out after my birth, even when Sarah was born 2 years later. I told myself I didn't need her, that she'd made her choice, he continued. But I followed her life from a distance. I knew when you girls were born, when your parents bought the bakery, when you both started school. I've been watching, Emma, but I was too ashamed to approach. Then why now? He smiled sadly. Because 3 months ago, I realized you were my granddaughter. You have your mother's hands when you work, the same focus, the same intuitive understanding of how to create something beautiful, and because I saw that you were being treated the same way I treated her, having your contributions diminished, your worth questioned, your dreams stolen by someone who claimed to know better. The parallels were devastating and illuminating. Sarah was treating me exactly as grandfather had treated my mother, dismissing my value, claiming superiority, demanding I accept a lesser role in my own life. I can't bring your mother back, he said quietly, but I can help you reclaim what's rightfully yours. We spent the next 3 hours planning my revenge. Grandfather wasn't just wealthy, he was strategically brilliant, a man who'd built his empire by understanding leverage and timing. He'd been watching Sweet Dreams operation for months, observing our customer patterns, our supplier relationships, our financial vulnerabilities. Sarah has overextended, he explained, showing me financial reports his investigators had compiled. She's borrowed heavily to fund expansion, taking on debt based on projected growth that depends entirely on your continued presence. If you were to leave suddenly, she'd be unable to maintain quality or meet her obligations. But I can't just leave, I protested. I need income, and she'll never give me references for another job. You won't need her references, Grandfather said with a smile that reminded me exactly whose granddaughter I was. You'll have something much better, your own business, with sufficient backing to not just compete with the Sweet Dreams, but to destroy it entirely. The plan he outlined was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its precision. I would resign without warning, leaving Sarah unable to replicate my recipes or maintain quality. Using Grandfather's resources, I would open a competing bakery in a superior location, hire away Sweet Dream's best employees, and serve evolved versions of my signature items that would make Sarah's offerings look amateurish by comparison. But the real masterstroke, Grandfather explained, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, will be the timing. Sarah's expansion has left her cash poor and heavily leveraged. When her revenue drops, and it will drop dramatically once you're gone, she'll be unable to service her debts. Within weeks, she'll be facing foreclosure. And then we buy Sweet Dreams at auction for a fraction of its value, reuniting you with your family's original bakery and completing your transformation from victim to victor. The plan was ruthless, comprehensive, and perfectly just. Sarah had stolen my work, my reputation, and my future. Now I would take it all back, with interest. I spent the weekend practicing my resignation speech, but when Monday morning arrived, I realized no speech was necessary. The words came easily, naturally, powered by 3 years of suppressed anger and newfound purpose. I quit, I announced, walking into Sarah's office and placing my resignation letter on her cluttered desk. Sarah looked up from her laptop where she'd been responding to emails about the upcoming food and wine feature. Her expression went through a series of rapid changes: confusion, disbelief, and finally, anger. You quit? Emma, don't be ridiculous. You can't just quit. Watch me. She leaned back in her chair, trying to project authority, but I could see uncertainty flickering in her eyes. And go where, exactly? No respectable bakery in Portland would hire you without references, and I certainly won't be providing any. You're nothing without this place, Emma, nothing without me. The words that would have devastated me a week ago now felt powerless. I had resources Sarah couldn't imagine, support she'd never dreamed of, and most importantly, I had the truth on my side. We'll see about that, I said simply. Her laugh was sharp, condescending, designed to cut me down. Oh, please. You think you're going to waltz into another job just because you have some culinary school certificate? Real business requires more than just knowing how to mix flour and eggs, Emma. It requires intelligence, sophistication, connections, things you've never had to develop because I've been handling them for you. I looked at this woman who had systematically stolen my dreams and claimed my achievements, who had diminished me at every opportunity while building her reputation on my stolen work. A month ago, her words would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. Today, they just sounded pathetic. Goodbye, Sarah, I said, turning toward the door. Emma, wait. Her voice had shifted, desperation creeping in around the edges. Look, maybe we've had some communication issues. Maybe I haven't been acknowledging your contributions enough. But we're family, we're partners. We can work this out. I paused at the threshold, looking back at her over my shoulder. You're right about one thing, Sarah. Real business does require intelligence, sophistication, and connections. You're about to find out which one of us actually has those qualities. I walked out that day with nothing but my recipes, my knowledge, and the backing of one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest. By the time Sarah realized what was happening, it would be far too late to stop me. The next morning, I met Grandfather at the offices of Chen Industries, a gleaming 40-story tower in downtown Portland that I'd driven past countless times without knowing it belonged to my family. His executive assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Patterson, led me through hallways lined with awards, patents, and photographs, documenting decades of business success. Emma, grandfather said, rising from behind a desk that was larger than my entire apartment kitchen. Are you ready to begin? The view from his office encompassed the entire city, from the Willamette River to the mountains beyond. Somewhere below us, Sarah was probably arriving at Sweet Dreams, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. I'm ready, I said. Within a week, I'd secured the perfect location for my revenge. A beautiful corner storefront just 3 blocks from Sweet Dreams, with twice the foot traffic, better parking, and a kitchen space that would allow me to create on a scale I'd only dreamed of. The previous tenants, a struggling cafe called The Daily Grind, had been barely making rent for months. With grandfather's backing, I offered them enough money to relocate to a smaller space they could actually afford, turning what could have been a hostile takeover into a mutually beneficial arrangement. Emma's Haven, I named my new venture, honoring both my mother's memory and my newfound independence. The name felt right on my tongue, promising sanctuary for both the baker and her customers. While Sarah continued her magazine interviews and social media campaigns, blissfully unaware of the storm approaching, I worked 18-hour days transforming my new space. But this wasn't just about creating a better bakery, this was about systematic warfare, and I'd learned strategy from the best. Grandfather had taught me that business wasn't just about having superior products, it was about understanding your competition's weaknesses and exploiting them ruthlessly. Sarah's greatest weakness was her complete dependence on my stolen recipes and her inability to recognize or develop genuine talent. Every war is won before the first battle, grandfather explained as we reviewed architectural plans for Emma's Haven. Sarah believes she's competing against a single baker who walked away from her generous employment. She has no idea she's actually facing a coordinated assault from someone with unlimited resources and intimate knowledge of her every vulnerability. The first phase of our attack was recruitment. I systematically approached every talented employee at Sweet Dreams, offering them not just better salaries, but something Sarah had never provided: respect, recognition, and opportunities for growth. Maria Santos, Sweet Dreams' head decorator, had been underpaid for 2 years despite her incredible artistic talent. She could create sugar flowers so realistic that customers tried to smell them, craft chocolate sculptures that belonged in art galleries, and execute buttercream techniques that would make professional cake decorators weep with envy. Sarah paid her barely above minimum wage and took credit for her work whenever photographers came around. Maria, I said, approaching her after her shift one evening as she waited for the bus, I'd like to offer you a position at my new bakery. Her eyes widened. Emma, I heard you quit. Sarah said you had some kind of breakdown. Not a breakdown, I said with a smile. A breakthrough. I'm opening Emma's Haven next month, and I need a head decorator who understands that beautiful cakes start with beautiful technique. I can offer you $35,000 a year to start, full benefits, profit sharing, and creative control over all decorative work. Plus, your name will be on every portfolio piece you create. Maria's bus arrived, but she didn't get on. Are you serious? Dead serious. Your talent deserves recognition and compensation. I should have offered this years ago. She quit the next morning. James Morrison, Sweet Dreams' morning shift manager, was a coffee expert who'd been relegated to operating our basic espresso machine despite having certifications from the Specialty Coffee Association. Sarah had repeatedly ignored his suggestions for improving our coffee program, dismissing him as just the opener whenever he proposed new brewing methods or supplier relationships. James, I said, catching him as he locked up the shop, how would you like to design and run the entire beverage program for a new bakery? His face lit up with interest. What kind of beverage program? Whatever kind you think would best complement artisanal baked goods. Full carte blanche, equipment, suppliers, menu development, everything. Plus $40,000 a year and a percentage of beverage sales. When do I start? Within 2 weeks, I'd hired away Sweet Dreams' 3 best employees, each one bringing skills and knowledge that Sarah had undervalued and underutilized. But more importantly, I'd gained detailed intelligence about Sweet Dreams' operations, supplier relationships, and financial obligations. The real masterstroke, however, was the menu. Sarah only knew the final versions of my recipes, the polished formulations I'd refined through countless iterations and months of experimentation. She had no understanding of the development process, the failed attempts, the subtle adjustments that transformed good recipes into exceptional ones. When I opened Emma's Haven with evolved versions of her signature items, the difference would be unmistakable to anyone with educated taste buds. I spent 3 weeks in my new kitchen, working 16-hour days to perfect what I privately called version 2.0 inches of my greatest hits. My new lavender honey cake wasn't just better than the one Sweet Dreams served. It was transcendent. I'd added notes of cardamom and orange blossom that elevated the flavor profile beyond anything Sarah could replicate, plus a honey buttercream that incorporated 3 different varietals for complexity she'd never even considered. My croissants achieved a new level of lamination precision, with distinct buttery layers that shattered at first bite and a subtle tang from an extended fermentation process. My sourdough boules had deeper, more complex flavors from a mother starter I'd been cultivating in secret for months. My decorated cookies featured techniques Maria and I had developed together, using natural food colorings and hand-painted details that made each piece a miniature work of art. But I didn't stop with improved versions of existing recipes. Using connections grandfather had cultivated over decades in business, I arranged partnerships that would make Emma's Haven the most sophisticated bakery Portland had ever seen. I collaborated with Stumptown coffee roasters to create exclusive blends designed specifically to complement my pastries. I partnered with local creameries to source the highest quality butter and cream. I established relationships with urban farms that would supply me with seasonal fruits and herbs hours after harvest. I even arranged for direct imports of specialty chocolates and vanilla that most bakeries couldn't access. The grand opening was set for a Thursday morning in early October, exactly 1 month after I'd quit Sweet Dreams. Grandfather had arranged for Portland's most influential food critics to receive personal invitations along with carefully curated gift boxes that showcased my new recipes. I'd scheduled pop-up events at high-end galleries and corporate offices, offering tastings that would introduce the city's cultural elite to Emma's Haven before we even opened our doors. 3 days before the opening, I stood in my completed bakery at midnight, surveying everything I'd built in 4 weeks. The space was beautiful, warm lighting, custom millwork, display cases that showcased my creations like jewelry in a boutique. The kitchen was a dream, with equipment Sarah could never afford and workflow designed for both efficiency and creativity. Most importantly, everything in this space was authentically mine. Every recipe, every technique, every design choice reflected my vision, my skill, my understanding of what exceptional baking could be. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like myself again. "Your mother would be so proud," grandfather said, joining me in my late-night survey. She always believed that honest work would ultimately triumph over deception. "Do you think this is what she would have wanted?" I asked. "This level of destruction?" Grandfather considered the question carefully. "Your mother believed in justice, Emma. She believed that people should face the consequences of their choices. Sarah chose to steal from you, to diminish you, to build her success on your stolen foundation. You're simply providing her with the natural results of those decisions." I nodded, looking around my beautiful new bakery one more time. Tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. By this time next week, Sarah's empire would be crumbling. By the end of the month, Sweet Dreams would be mine. The opening day of Emma's Haven exceeded my wildest expectations. By 6 a.m., 2 hours before we officially opened, a line had formed outside our doors. Word had spread through Portland's foodie network with viral intensity, fueled by the preview tastings and the mysterious story of the talented baker who'd suddenly disappeared from Sweet Dreams. I watched through the kitchen window as customers streamed in, their faces lighting up as they tasted my evolved creations. The expressions of delight, surprise, and pure pleasure reminded me why I'd fallen in love with baking in the first place: the almost magical ability to create joy through flour, butter, and technique. "Emma?" Maria called from the front, her voice barely containing excitement. "The food blogger from Eater Portland is here, and she wants to interview you about the lavender cake." For the first time in years, I walked to the front of my bakery to accept credit for my own work. The interview went perfectly. I demonstrated my lamination technique, explained the science behind my sourdough starter, and shared the story of developing my signature flavor combinations. When the blogger asked about my background, I spoke confidently about my culinary training, my family's baking tradition, and my vision for elevating Portland's artisanal food scene. "What about your previous work at Sweet Dreams?" she asked. "How would you compare the two experiences?" I smiled diplomatically. Sweet Dreams taught me valuable lessons about the business side of baking, but Emma's Haven allows me to fully express my culinary vision without compromise. Within hours of opening, my cash register was ringing constantly. Customers were taking photos of my pastries, posting enthusiastic reviews on social media, and calling friends to recommend immediate visits. By noon, I'd sold out of croissants. By 2 p.m., the lavender honey cake was gone. By closing time, I'd generated more revenue in one day than Sweet Dreams typically saw in 3. The reviews started appearing within 24 hours, and they were everything I dreamed of. "Emma's Haven announces the arrival of a true artisan," wrote the Portland Monthly food critic. While other bakeries focus on Instagram-worthy presentations, Emma Chen demonstrates mastery of fundamental techniques that transform simple ingredients into transcendent experiences. Her lavender honey cake alone justifies the drive across town. The Oregonian's review was even more enthusiastic. "Portland's bakery scene has a new queen, and her name is Emma Chen. From the moment you bite into one of her impossibly flaky croissants to your last spoonful of the most perfectly balanced coffee you've ever tasted, Emma's Haven delivers experiences that redefine what artisanal baking can be." But the review that mattered most came from Eater Portland, whose critic had apparently done some investigative work on my background. The mysterious disappearance of Sweet Dreams Bakery's assistant baker now makes perfect sense. Emma Chen wasn't assisting anyone. She was the creative force behind Portland's most celebrated baked goods. Her new venture, Emma's Haven, showcases technique and innovation that makes Sweet Dreams' current offerings look amateurish by comparison. One has to wonder what other assistant bakers are actually the unrecognized talent behind successful restaurants. The implication was clear, and the Portland food community picked up on it immediately. Within a week, Sweet Dreams was facing its first wave of customer defections as food lovers discovered that the real talent had moved 3 blocks east. Sarah's response was swift and predictably desperate. She tried to match my prices, then undercut them when that didn't work. She launched a social media campaign claiming I'd stolen proprietary recipes, a strategy that backfired spectacularly when food writers pointed out that my versions were clearly more sophisticated and technically superior to Sweet Dreams' current offerings. Most damaging of all, she began publicly attacking me in interviews and social media posts, calling me vindictive, ungrateful, and delusional. Emma seems to have forgotten who trained her. She posted on Sweet Dreams' Instagram account, "I gave her an opportunity when she was just a culinary school graduate with no real-world experience. It's disappointing to see her use the skills I taught her to attack the business that made her career possible." The post generated hundreds of comments, but not the supportive responses Sarah had expected. Instead, Portland's food community rallied to my defense, with former Sweet Dreams customers sharing stories about my obvious talent and Sarah's treatment of employees. "I always wondered why the quality was so inconsistent at Sweet Dreams," wrote one commenter. "Now I know, Emma wasn't always the one baking." "I asked Emma about a technique once and she explained it beautifully," wrote another. "When I asked Sarah the same question, she couldn't give me a straight answer." The mask Sarah had worn for 3 years was finally slipping, and the entitled, cruel person underneath was becoming impossible to hide. 2 weeks after Emma's Haven opened, I received a call that changed everything. "Emma," said a familiar voice when I answered my phone during a brief break between the morning and lunch rushes. "This is Jessica Martinez from Food and Wine magazine." My blood pressure spiked. The feature story about Sweet Dreams was scheduled to run in the December issue, complete with Sarah's lies about creating my recipes. "Miss Martinez," I said carefully, "how can I help you?" "I'm calling because I've been hearing some interesting things about you and your new bakery. After visiting Emma's Haven yesterday, I have some serious questions about the interview I conducted with your sister last month." My heart started racing. "What kind of questions?" The kind that require a follow-up article. Would you be available for an interview this afternoon? I think food and wine readers deserve to know the real story behind Sweet Dreams Bakery. The interview took place in my kitchen, with Jessica watching me demonstrate the techniques Sarah had claimed as her own. I explained the development process behind each recipe, showed her my original notes and failed experiments, and answered detailed technical questions that proved my intimate knowledge of every formula. Sarah told me she'd been developing these recipes since culinary school, Jessica said, sampling my lavender honey cake. But you graduated from culinary school, not her. That's correct. She also claimed these were family recipes passed down through generations. But according to my research, your family's original bakery served primarily traditional Chinese baked goods, not French pastries. Also correct. I developed these recipes myself, using techniques I learned at culinary school and through my own experimentation. Jessica nodded, making notes. One final question. Why didn't you correct the record during our original interview? I considered how to answer honestly without sounding bitter. Sarah had convinced me that public relations were her responsibility and that my role was to stay in the kitchen. I was naive enough to believe that the success of Sweet Dreams was more important than who got credit for individual contributions. And now? Now I understand that in the food industry, reputation and recognition directly impact career opportunities. When someone systematically erases your contributions, they're not just stealing credit, they're stealing your future. The article ran 3 weeks later, and it destroyed Sarah's world in a single morning. Sweet Dreams or Stolen Dreams? The Portland Bakery Built on Lies was the headline that greeted food and wine readers across the country. Jessica had done thorough investigative work, interviewing former employees, culinary school classmates, and industry professionals who'd interacted with both Sarah and me. The article included side-by-side photos of identical recipes, Sarah's versions looking flat and amateurish, mine perfectly executed with professional-level presentation. A month ago, I praised Sweet Dreams Bakery's innovative approach to classical French pastries, the article read. Today, I'm forced to report that those innovations weren't created by the person who claimed credit for them. Emma Chen, described to me as an assistant baker, appears to have been the true creative force behind Sweet Dreams' success. The article detailed Sarah's systematic theft of my work, her false claims about family recipes, and her deliberate diminishment of my role in interviews and public appearances. Most damning of all, it included quotes from former employees confirming that I had been the primary baker and recipe developer from day one. Sarah Martinez may have the business degree, one unnamed former employee was quoted as saying, but Emma Chen had the talent. Every successful recipe, every innovative technique, every creation that brought customers through our doors, that was Emma's work. The conclusion was devastating. In an industry built on authenticity, creativity, and technical skill, Sweet Dreams Bakery appears to have built its reputation on systematic deception. For food lovers seeking genuine artisanal excellence in Portland, the choice is clear. Follow the real talent to Emma's haven. The response was immediate and catastrophic for Sweet Dreams. Their social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from customers who felt deceived. Catering contracts were canceled overnight. Corporate partnerships dissolved. The food bloggers and influencers who had championed Sarah's genius quietly removed their endorsements and distanced themselves from the controversy. Most importantly, foot traffic at Sweet Dreams dropped by 60% within a week of the article's publication. Meanwhile, Emma's Haven was busier than ever, with customers lining up to support the real baker and taste authentically innovative pastries. I was working late on a Friday evening, preparing for what had become our consistently busy Saturday mornings, when my phone rang. Emma, Sarah's voice was small, defeated. Nothing like the confident entrepreneur who'd built her reputation on my stolen work. We need to talk. I agreed to meet her at a neutral coffee shop the next morning, curious to see how far she'd fallen. The woman who walked in barely resembled the polished business owner who'd fired me just 2 months earlier. Her clothes were wrinkled, her usually perfect hair was greasy and pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "I'm losing everything," she said without preamble, collapsing into the chair across from me. "The bank is calling my loans. I can't make payroll next week. Half my suppliers are demanding immediate payment. The health department is suddenly finding violations that were never problems before. I sipped my coffee and waited for her to continue, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. The food and wine article killed me, she continued, her voice breaking. Everyone thinks I'm a fraud, a thief. Food writers who used to return my calls won't even respond to emails. Yelp reviews are calling for boycotts. I'm getting death threats from people who think I'm some kind of master manipulator. Aren't you? I asked quietly. She looked up sharply, tears spilling down her cheeks. Emma, please. I know I I know I made mistakes. I know I didn't always give you the credit you deserved. But I never meant for things to go this far. You didn't mean to steal my recipes and claim them as your own. You didn't mean to introduce yourself as the head baker to journalists. You didn't mean to erase my contributions for 3 years while building your reputation on my work. That's not, yes, but she struggled to find words that would minimize her betrayal. I was trying to protect the business. I thought if customers saw you as the talent, they might try to poach you, or you might leave and start competing with us. I was trying to keep us together. The lies came so easily to her, even now, even when her world was collapsing around her. Sarah, I said calmly, you fired me. You literally forced me to leave and start competing with you. Your worst fear came true because of your own actions. She was sobbing openly now, mascara streaming down her face. Please, Emma, we're family. You can't let me lose everything Mom and Dad built. The casual manipulation was breathtaking. After 3 years of treating me like hired help, after systematically stealing my work and claiming my achievements, she was invoking our parents' memory to guilt me into saving her. Mom and Dad built a small neighborhood bakery that served traditional Chinese pastries to their community, I said. You mortgaged their legacy to fund your fantasy of being a famous baker. Sweet Dreams isn't their legacy, it's your ego project built on my stolen work. That's not fair. I built Sweet Dreams into the most successful bakery in Portland. No, Sarah, I built Sweet Dreams into the most successful bakery in Portland. You just took a credit for it. Her expression cycled through anger, desperation, and finally, bargaining. Look, maybe we've had some communication issues. Maybe I haven't been acknowledging your contributions enough. But we can fix this. I'll give you whatever you want. Equal partnership, equal billing, your name on everything. Just help me save Sweet Dreams. I looked at this woman who had systematically destroyed my confidence, stolen my achievements, and made me feel worthless in my own family's business. A month ago, her offer might have tempted me. Today, it sounded pathetic. No, I said simply. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, Sarah, I won't help you save Sweet Dreams, but I will make you an offer. I slid a business card across the table, grandfather's attorney's contact information. When the bank forecloses next week, I'll buy the property and assets at auction. You can walk away with whatever equity remains after your debts are settled, or you can fight the inevitable and lose everything, including your credit and any possibility of starting over. Your choice. She stared at the card like it was a poisonous snake. You can't afford to buy Sweet Dreams. You're just a baker with a small shop. This is insane. I smiled then, the same sharp expression I'd inherited from grandfather. You never did know me as well as you thought you did. What's that supposed to mean? I stood up, leaving money on the table for my coffee. It means you spent 3 years underestimating me, Sarah. You assumed I was nothing without you, that I had no resources, no connections, no ability to succeed independently. You were wrong about everything. Emma, wait! She grabbed my wrist as I turned to leave. Who's backing you? No bank would give you enough credit to compete with Sweet Dreams, let alone buy it. Someone's helping you. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back at her desperate face. Someone is helping me. Someone who recognizes talent when he sees it, who values family loyalty, and who doesn't appreciate watching his granddaughter being exploited. Her grip loosened. Granddaughter. William Chen, chairman and CEO of Chen Industries. My grandfather, whom you never bothered to research despite stealing from his granddaughter for 3 years. The color drained from Sarah's face as the implications hit her. Chen Industries was one of the largest privately held companies in the Pacific Northwest, with a net worth that could buy and sell Sweet Dreams 100 times over. That's impossible. she whispered. Your family doesn't have money. Your parents were just, they ran a small bakery. My mother was disowned for marrying dad, I explained patiently. But blood is blood and talent is talent. Grandfather has been watching me work for months, seeing how you treated me, recognizing that I was the real baker behind Sweet Dream's success. When I finally reached out to him, he was more than happy to help me reclaim what you stole. Sarah released my arm and slumped back in her chair, the full scope of her situation finally becoming clear. She wasn't just facing competition from a talented baker. She was facing the full weight of a $1 billion empire determined to see justice done. This is revenge, she said weakly. No, I corrected. This is consequence. You chose to steal from me, to diminish me, to build your success on my work while treating me like hired help. Everything that's happening to you now is the natural result of those choices. I left her sitting in that coffee shop, staring at the business card that represented her complete defeat. By the time I reached Emma's Haven, my phone was buzzing with a text from grandfather's attorney. Foreclosure proceedings begin Monday. Sweet Dreams will be on the auction block by Friday. Are you ready? I was more than ready. The foreclosure moved with brutal efficiency. Sarah had mortgaged everything to maintain her lifestyle and fund her increasingly desperate marketing campaigns, trying to win back customers. She owed money to suppliers, contractors, the bank, the health department for accumulated violation fines, and even her landlord for back rent on her apartment. When the accounting was complete, Sweet Dream's debts exceeded its assets by nearly $200,000. Sarah's personal guarantees meant she was liable for the shortfall, effectively ensuring she'd leave Portland with nothing but the clothes on her back. Grandfather's legal team made the purchase process seamless. We bought Sweet Dream's assets at auction for exactly $127,000, a fraction of their replacement value. The lot included the prime downtown location, all equipment, remaining inventory, and most importantly, any legal claim to the recipes Sarah had stolen from me. The Portland business community watched the proceedings with fascination. Local newspapers covered the story as a cautionary tale about the importance of authentic leadership and proper treatment of employees. Business schools began developing case studies about how ego and exploitation could destroy even successful enterprises. Food writers called it the most dramatic reversal of fortune in Portland's culinary history. Sarah left town the day after the auction closed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved back to our aunt's house in Sacramento, taking a minimum wage job at a chain restaurant where nobody knew her story. Her dreams of culinary fame had been replaced by the harsh reality of starting over at 30 with no money, no references, and a reputation that followed her anywhere the food industry existed. She'd lost everything: her business, her identity as Portland's baking prodigy, her financial security, and, most devastatingly, her ability to claim credit for work that was never hers. All that remained was the truth. She'd been nothing without my talent to exploit. The transformation of the original Sweet Dreams location into Emma's Haven downtown took 3 weeks. I kept the best equipment, donated the outdated pieces to a culinary school where young bakers could learn proper technique, and completely redesigned the space to reflect my vision. Gone were Sarah's Instagram-worthy but impractical design choices, replaced with a layout that prioritized both customer experience and kitchen efficiency. The new space featured an open kitchen where customers could watch the baking process, educational displays explaining traditional techniques, and a tasting bar where we offered samples of seasonal specialties. Most importantly, every recipe, every technique, and every innovation was finally credited to its true creator. The grand reopening drew crowds that stretched around 2 city blocks. Mayor Wheeler attended, along with food critics from Seattle, San Francisco, and even New York. The James Beard Foundation sent a representative to document what they called a masterclass in authentic artisanal excellence. I stood behind the counter of my family's original bakery location, now bearing my name and showcasing my life's work, watching customers experience the joy I'd spent years creating in anonymity. Maria decorated a wedding cake in the front window while James crafted pour-over coffee that perfectly complemented my morning pastries. Every member of my team was credited, recognized, and fairly compensated for their contributions. Your mother would be so proud, grandfather said, joining me for a quiet moment during the celebration. She believed that honest work would always triumph over deception, even when it takes time for justice to emerge. Do you think I was too harsh? I asked, watching through the window as Sarah's former landlord hung a for rent sign in what had been her apartment building. She'd lost everything. Grandfather considered the question carefully, as he always did. Sarah made a choice, Emma. Every day for 3 years, she chose to steal credit for your work. She chose to diminish your contributions. She chose to treat you as disposable while building her reputation on your stolen achievements. You didn't destroy her. You simply stopped enabling her theft. He was right, of course. I hadn't forced Sarah to lie to journalists to claim my recipes as her own, or to treat her sister like hired help. I'd simply removed myself from her exploitation and built something authentic in response. The success of Emma's Haven exceeded even my wildest projections. Within 6 months, I had a 3-month waiting list for custom cakes. Food Network approached me about a show documenting traditional baking techniques. Publishers competed to offer me cookbook deals. Culinary schools invited me to teach master classes. More importantly, I was building something sustainable and ethical. Every employee received fair wages, health benefits, and profit sharing. We sourced ingredients from local farms and suppliers who shared our commitment to quality and sustainability. Young bakers who wanted to learn traditional techniques could apply for mentorship programs that provided real education, not exploitation. Emma's Haven became more than just a bakery. It became a model for how food businesses could operate with integrity while achieving excellence. 1 year after the grand reopening, I received an unexpected letter. The return address was Sacramento, and I recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately. Dear Emma, the letter began. I know I have no right to contact you after everything that happened. I know I hurt you in ways that probably can't be forgiven. But I needed you to know that I understand now what I did to you, and I'm sorry. She went on to describe her year of working in chain restaurants, earning minimum wage and taking orders from managers half her age. She wrote about the humiliation of explaining employment gaps to potential employers, about the shame of admitting she'd never actually developed the recipes that had made her famous. I told myself I was protecting the business, she continued, but the truth is I was protecting my ego. I was terrified that people would see you as the real talent and I'd become irrelevant. So I made you irrelevant instead, and I convinced myself that was justified because I was managing the business side. The letter was 3 pages long, detailing her gradual understanding of how systematically she'd undermined me, how her fear of being overshadowed had led her to commit what amounted to professional identity theft. I know I can never make up for what I stole from you, she concluded, but I wanted you to know that you were right about everything. You were the real baker, the real talent, the real creative force behind Sweet Dreams. I was just someone who was good at taking credit for other people's work. I'm trying to be a better person now, but I know that doesn't undo the damage I caused. The letter was signed simply Sarah, with no return address or contact information. She wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, just acknowledging the truth that had taken her a year of consequences to fully understand. I read the letter twice, then filed it away in my office desk. Sarah's apology didn't change what had happened, but it confirmed that justice had been served. She understood now what she'd done, and more importantly, she understood that her fall had been entirely self-inflicted. 2 years after opening Emma's Haven, I stood in the same location where this story began, but everything had changed. The space that had once showcased Sarah's stolen dreams now displayed my authentic achievements. Awards lined the walls, not for recipes I'd created, but Sarah had claimed, but for innovations the culinary world knew were mine. James Beard Foundation recognition for Outstanding Baker. Food and Wine magazine's Best New Chef Award, a cookbook that had spent 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list. A PBS series documenting traditional baking techniques that had been nominated for 3 Emmy Awards. Most importantly, I'd built something that couldn't be stolen because it was based on genuine skill, authentic relationships, and honest work. Emma's Haven employed 37 people across 3 locations, all of them properly credited and fairly compensated for their contributions. We'd trained over 100 young bakers through our mentorship program, teaching them that success came from mastery and integrity, not theft and manipulation. The empire I'd built would last because it was built on truth. That evening, as I locked the doors of Emma's Haven downtown and walked through the quiet streets of Portland, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I'd been a talented but naive young woman who believed that good work would naturally be recognized and rewarded. I'd trusted my sister to treat me fairly, to acknowledge my contributions, to share in the success we were building together. Sarah had taught me that trust must be earned and verified, that talent without self advocacy was meaningless, and that family bonds don't excuse professional betrayal. She'd also taught me that justice might be delayed, but it was rarely denied to those willing to fight for it. But most importantly, she'd taught me that the sweetest revenge isn't just succeeding despite someone's attempts to destroy you. The sweetest revenge is succeeding so completely that you get to decide their fate when their house of lies finally collapses. I'd started this journey as a victim, someone whose work was stolen and whose contributions were erased. I'd ended it as an empire builder, someone whose name was synonymous with excellence and integrity in Portland's culinary scene. Sweet Dreams Bakery was dead, killed by the very lies that had built it. But Emma's Haven was thriving, built on the foundation Sarah had tried to steal: genuine talent, authentic creativity, and the kind of honest work that creates lasting success. In the end, justice hadn't just been served. It had been decorated with crystallized lavender, presented on my grandmother's china, and enjoyed by customers who knew exactly who had created their perfect moment of sweetness. Sarah had taken my credit, but she'd never taken my ability. She'd stolen my recognition, but she'd never stolen my skill. And when the reckoning finally came, skill had triumphed over theft, truth had defeated lies, and the real baker had reclaimed everything that was rightfully hers. The story ended exactly as it should have, with the genuine talent finally receiving the recognition she'd earned, and the thief left with nothing but the consequences of her choices. Sometimes the best stories are also the truest ones. And sometimes when justice is served at exactly the right temperature, it tastes sweeter than any dessert you could ever imagine.